Hi, I'm Dave Sellinger. I'm joined by Roger Stager, and we are presenting a state-by-state analysis that we've done on COVID. We're releasing this to the world with all the code and open source to really kind of share our best intent at getting a handle on how do we grapple with this problem. And our core thesis of this analysis was to kind of answer the question, like, what could we do if we were Spain 10 days ago? What would we do differently? And not to do it from kind of a anecdotal fear place, but what would we do? And we came up with a thesis that by doing this analysis state by state instead of as a country, that we could get a better set of actionable insights where states could take actions. And because states are facing the problem differently, um, and we're lucky that we still have time. States like California have taken action, and states like New York have taken pretty severe action, but other states have not. And the question really comes up: should we be taking more action? Should we be panicking? Things like that. And in general, our response is we should be taking decisive action, but not panicking. And so we've taken a methodology of analyzing the data that are available from the World Health Organization and CDC to do as best as possible a state by state analysis as if each state were a country, just like Spain or Italy. Roger, anything you'd add to that?
No, just the justification of that is that the ICU beds that are available are in state, and that's why we kind of create those boundaries.
It's a great point, right? Like the ICU beds in Texas are not particularly helpful to somebody who's sick in Wisconsin. And so it's also a particularly poignant thing. And that's why we put the square miles for each of these areas, is that it's just not reasonable that if you're suffering from pneumonia and need an ICU, that you go there, to go to another state. And so obviously we're going to be really transparent about the caveats of our analysis. We know that testing is still something that's being developed in the US. So we have to deal with the data that we have. That said, we believe that even though there's some volatility because of the lack of testing in the US, that there are useful conclusions that we can draw. And again, act decisively and act early without having to panic. Some of the key data sets that we used to do this analysis were we computed data using the open source data that's been released, which is a combination of the CSSE, GIS data, and the WHO. Because state data were only available from the CSSE data set, you'll see in the code that we focused on that. We used population estimates from the 2019 census, from the Census Bureau estimates of 2019. We used another ArcGIS estimate for hospitals, and then we're releasing all the code in open source. So if we're not claiming that we are reaching the end all be all. In fact, we've been working on this for now, I think 4 days, and every day we're seeing that there's more data available. So we really feel our biggest contribution is also making all this code available. So if there are data hackers out there that want to work on this and improve it, if they see an issue with the assumptions, they can come forward with, hey, here's your complete methodology. We changed this assumption, and therefore your conclusions shift by X or Y or Z. The methodology that we used, as I mentioned, is to segregate the data by state, compute all the key features of the state. And this is kind of a hard thing to do, again, because there is a high volatility of data because of the testing. We had to make assumptions in terms of how many ICUs were available per state. We only had access to hospital counts per ICU. We also really, really wish that that data would be available on a county by county basis. If there's a really precise way to think about ICUs, availability, resources, would be to do it on a county basis. We also recognize that we wish we would have been able to have access to things like ventilator data, but we used a proxy for ICUs to basically compute where is that capacity line on the curve that you guys have been seeing about flatten the curve. And so again, we're releasing this with the intent of making a step forward in a more precise analysis. We also recognize that there are social and political commentary that may exist around this. We're not doing this blindly or eyes closed. That said, that's why we're releasing it as open source. Is our intent is to be as socially responsible as possible. And seeing as we have not seen anyone analyze these data on a state-by-state basis, we felt compelled to at least share what we have seen so far, because the conclusions are pretty strong, and they're pretty important for people to know. Roger, anything from you on this one so far?
Yep, continue.
Whew, all right. So again, we made an assumption because we did not have access to the exact ICU data. We know that ICUs are not the same, but according to the NIH, they did a study a few years ago, and approximately 15% of all hospital beds are ICU beds. We also recognize that in some states they have more ventilators than ICU beds, and in other states they have fewer. So we know that this could be better with that, but we made the best informed assumptions that we could based on the data that we have. We also had to make some assumptions about the distribution of the population. And this definitely has an impact on things because people don't live all in the same areas. And in fact, people don't catch the COVID or other infectious diseases the same in a rural area as you do in a city. Infectious diseases with a high growth rate, like the COVID disease that we're dealing with right now, have a concentration in metropolitan areas. We're seeing exceptions to that for sure. But again, in terms of making an analysis of all of the 50 states, what we've basically assumed is that 90% of the cases are going to be in these concentrated areas where there's going to be 40% of the population and approximately 40% of the beds. You'll see that that's not a dumb assumption either, because if you look at the distribution of hospitals and ICUs across the country, there are actually more hospitals in the less dense states than there are hospitals in the more dense states, because they don't have to have as many beds in the denser states because they have a ability to optimize for higher utilization. And so the states that actually have the most ICUs and the most beds are interestingly enough some of the more rural states out there. Again, we recognize that we've made key assumptions. Our goal is not to not make assumptions in order to try to stay 100% right. Our goal is to make assumptions that we think are informed and be really, really transparent about them. And so we've operated as best we can looking at each of these different things. And the first assumption we made is that states are going to be different. And that absolutely played out in the numbers, right? Like these are reasonably clean numbers, even with the volatility of testing still being developed. It is absolutely clear that states have different problems. And so therefore actions, by state, actions by individuals in various states should be different. And you'll see here, the state that stands out the most unconditionally here is Washington State. Washington State has over 1/100th of 1% of their total population. I believe as of today, it is 0.14%. 0.014% of the entire population of Washington is infected with COVID as of today. We've been able to watch this over the last few days. I'll switch over to the code. So you're going to see the dirty code beneath this whole thing. And we made this even into an animation. And so if you look at over the last 5 days, which is when state by state data became available, you'll see that it's very clearly happening on a state basis. And so other states are approaching the same kind of critical state where they have over 250 cases. And what we've seen, at least globally, is that when you get to 250 cases, this thing doesn't kind of trickle out on its own. It does need pretty decisive action. And increasingly, not just Washington, California, and New York, states like Texas, Colorado, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, New Jersey, and Massachusetts are also approaching that critical state where they have to act in order to affect change in this disease. Have I missed anything yet, Roger?
No, you're doing good.
All right, doing my best. We'll get through this. All right, next we analyzed that the growth rate's also different, right? So we in order to compute the growth rate, for those of you that poke into the code, there are some states, right? For example, Colorado and Florida, who have very, very few cases. But if you assume that the global growth rate of 29-ish% applies to these states, they will also be facing challenges as well. But what we had to do to compute the growth rate was we started with the global average. And for states that had more than a critical amount, we were able to compute the growth rate on a state-by-state basis. And that critical number was 100, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we played, yeah, I think hundreds where we left it.
We
Also,
tried
to
a
be
number of
clear,
different numbers, and what played out, again, having the advantage of having worked on this for 4 days, is we were able to see, did our prediction from yesterday actually do a good job of predicting tomorrow? And until the states had about 100 cases, it was not a good prediction for tomorrow. But at 100 cases, we started seeing that the prediction of the growth rate was pretty effective.
and to be clear, the growth rate that you're quoting is a day over day increase in reported infected.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's super important, right? And that ranged really on the low end at about 18%, and on the high end was in excess of 50%. And this is day over day cases. This is not something that's growing a little bit. If you don't understand exponential growth, there was a great piece in the Washington Post that we would recommend you watch. They do a great job of kind of illustrating that as well. Again, this is that percentage of the total population that's infected. We see a high degree, especially from the state of Washington. I think this might have been yesterday's data. I apologize. We're running fast and hard on this one. Next, as I mentioned, the per capita hospital beds, right? This is an interesting thing too that's very different between the different states. It ranged from kind of on the low end of 2 in some of these more dense states to upwards of like 5 and in some of these, I think you called them the Mississippi River states, right? The Mississippi River states had a lot more beds available, which I think is going to give them an advantage in tackling this problem. Now, what is the goal today? Our goal today is, we've seen this curve. What is this number, right? We've seen this curve, and is it a really flat curve? Is that number very far away, or is it really close? And what we found, using that ICU, we estimated 15% of all hospital beds in all areas are ICUs. We computed how long is it going to take for these different states to reach 100% capacity of their ICUs on the basis of identified cases of COVID. This doesn't mean they're going to run out of ICUs in this number of days. This means that there will be enough cases based on the hospitalization and ICU rate of COVID in other areas, which I believe we estimated that to be about 15% of all cases will ultimately end up in the ICU, that if those cases that are identified today play out, it usually takes between 5 and 10 days that the person then, after being identified, has to go to the ICU. If they have to go to the ICU, this is when we're anticipating all the ICUs in that metropolitan area of the state to run out. And this is why, again, we believe there should be decisive action that is different on the basis of states. Some states have quite some time, right? And some states like Montana only have a couple of cases. And what we've seen consistently is that if you can act decisively when there's only 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 cases, you can make this then fizzle out. You have to act locally, you have to act decisively, but you can make it fizzle out. For all the states that have more than 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 cases, they've got to act more decisively on a broader basis. And states such as Louisiana that have 10 days until their ICUs are filled up, Colorado, Washington, those cases are going to grow to the level that their ICUs are going to be accounted for pretty much 100%. And again, we're releasing this with all the data with the intent of encouraging those states to take the appropriate action to protect their citizens.
Sally, one comment there. I think our model assumes that the 15% of the ICU beds are already available, which might not be the case also with flu season still in action.
That's absolutely true. And so again, the point really being here, though, that the results here are very different on a state by state basis. You'll notice, though, that every state in the nation, at the growth rates that they're currently expressing, don't get through this, right, that without having to take some sort of action. And we computed a subsequent model that determined that until you get the growth rate down to about 5% on a day over day basis, that your ICUs will stay unstable. So we have to really kind of, just like China has done, squish it down and then slowly grow back. From an epidemiological perspective, neither of us are epidemiologists. We do recognize that there is an important act of certain people needing to be exposed in order to develop antibodies. And again, I think we're seeing this in the countries that are starting to come out the other side, that having those people that are exposed and have antibodies slows the growth rate within their communities as well. And again, that's also exhibited in the Washington Post animation. We're releasing all of the results of what we've seen in terms of the individual days. And so this is the results. Oh, shoot, I think this was computed yesterday. These are the results from yesterday. The good news, by the way, from day over day is that we're seeing that our predictions yesterday and the day before are consistent with the next day's predictions. And we'll release an update to this once we compute this today. And that every state has kind of a compelling reason to take action like was taken in the state of California to issue a shelter-in-place order in order to protect their citizens. The one state here that I don't think anybody's talked about so far is our good friends in West Virginia, right, where they still have 0 cases. I'd say keep it that way. You guys are in great shape. But we've kind of taken the time to star out the cases where we still think decisive action in a very precise manner could kind of stop this thing before anything grows. And again, the goal here was to say what is flat enough. And there's been a case that's been made in a couple of different analytical studies that say, look, it doesn't look like that prior curve where there's a lot of room here. When you're using the ICUs are very, very rare resources. And that if we do want to protect these ICUs, that we have to drive this curve down, and we have to do it pretty quickly. And I think that the actions taken by the states are appropriate. We applaud that the CDC and WHO are taking steps now to kind of push further in that direction. I think the CDC, for a broad set of reasons, was a little bit slow, but we're glad to see that they're moving in the right direction, and we would be happy to see further action in that direction. I think this is a summary of everything that we just said. We recognize that, again, as statisticians, there are further things that we could be doing. And we do also wanted to share that this is the growth rate in Italy, and that they have taken actions. They took actions really kind of starting at the end of February, and then they took decisive actions in the first week of March, and that their growth rate is starting to trend down in the last couple of weeks. And so these actions do have the results. We already saw it in Wuhan, China, and those actions do have results, and they do enable people to get through this without having to panic and freak out. Again, we don't think that anyone should be panicking, but people need to be taking decisive action. Again, as statisticians, as I mentioned, there are further steps. First and foremost, would be getting actual ICU data, actual county data would be phenomenal. Roger, I don't know if you want to talk about what you were thinking of in terms of the simulation based on the individual. Where'd it go? The individual elderly population versus the younger population in terms of simulating that.
Yeah, we'd like to come up with something that shows that. The idea being that the change in behavior that is appropriate is different for different risk groups. If you're in a high risk group, you really want to shut down contact. If you're in a lower risk group, you want to slow down contact enough to where we can reach that 5% day over day growth rate. I think that's what you're referring to, Sally.
Yeah, that's great. So again, to kind of go back to what the conclusions are that we reached after doing this, net, right, is again that yes, every state is in a different situation. Two, every state could certainly take this analysis. Again, we're releasing the code and put in their own data, put in their county data, put in their ICU data, and reach their own conclusions. And we are open to being wrong. This is not this is the right answer. This is a stake in the stand, and it's a starting place, and that's why we're releasing it as open source. We would be more than happy if states went through this analysis and reached their own conclusions. That is our hope and that is our desire. But we also are requesting that action be taken reasonably quickly, because the number of days that are left for a number of these states before they're going to have enough cases that they use up all of their ICUs is not months and months and months. It's measured in weeks. And so we think that action, because it does take about 10 days to see results, and at the current growth rates, I believe that numbers, increase really dramatically over the course of this. They double pretty much every 3 days. So you need to take action quickly, especially because the results are going to take 5 to 10 days to have any sort of result.
I think that's a real key message, is that people aren't used to dealing with exponential growth types of behavior. And you look at something and you say, well, it goes from 1 to 10 or 10 to 100. That doesn't seem like a big change for a state. But that same ratio continues, and suddenly it hits 1,000. And you realize that in the next week, it's going to be 10,000 and then 100,000 and 1,000,000. That's just 3 weeks. It goes from 1,000 to 1,000,000. So that, combined with the fact that what the actions you take today will not have an effect for another 7 to 10 days. So the situation will be 10 to 100 times worse when your actions have an effect. So you are going to have to act early when it doesn't seem like it's crisis. You need to act early so that you can not get to that point. And
Yeah,
IC beds is the way to look at it. Keeping the IC beds open so people can be treated is the key point.
Yeah. So again, we are happy to share this with the world, share this with the community. Everything that we've done is open source. We really hope that states take this seriously. We really hope that the CDC and the WHO continue to take strong action against this. And we think that by doing so, we can get through this much more quickly and with less economic impact to all of us who are all already affected. So with that, thank you. And again, we'll release this with all of the code and with this presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.